What would you do if the people meant to love your child became her greatest threat? When Lauren discovered her 8-year-old daughter Emily scrubbing the kitchen floor, alone, abandoned by her own grandparents, everything changed. What followed was a harrowing battle for justice, love, and the right to define what family truly means. As old loyalties shattered and long-hidden truths surfaced, Lorraine and her husband David faced a devastating choice: fight for their daughter or lose her trust forever. Stay with us to hear this powerful true story of betrayal, resilience, and a mother's unwavering love. Chapter 1. The grandmother's smile that never reached her eyes. I thought I was bringing my daughter into a family. I didn't know I was handing her to wolves. The late afternoon sun slanted through the sprawling windows of Margaret and Charles Bennett's stately home in Bellevue, catching on the crystal chandelier and making the polished floors gleam like a showroom. Everything about this house spoke of wealth, old money, old values. And today, the house was thrumming with the chaotic energy of Sophie's 8th birthday party. I stood just inside the grand foyer, adjusting the straps of my black leather purse, watching Emily flit nervously between groups of children she barely knew. She had chosen her dress carefully that morning, a pale lavender with a tiny bow at the waist, and asked me to braid her curls like a princess. Her small fingers had trembled with excitement when we wrapped the gift for her cousin Sophie. Now, though, her smile was fading with each passing moment. Across the room, Margaret, immaculate in a slate-gray dress and string of pearls, hovered near the cake table, a fixed smile pasted on her face. She leaned down to Sophie, smoothing the child's golden hair with a practiced touch. The warmth in her eyes was undeniable. And when Emily approached with her carefully chosen card and small gift bag, Margaret's smile remained perfectly intact, only now it stopped just short of her eyes. "Well, isn't that sweet?" she said crisply, taking the bag and setting it aside. No hug, no thank you, just a perfunctory glance in my direction. "Run along and play now, Emily." I felt a familiar tightening in my chest. David, sensing my tension, placed a reassuring hand on my lower back. "It's just how she is," he murmured softly. "She's trying. Give her time." I wanted to believe him. Truly I did. But this wasn't new. Since the day David and I married, since the day he adopted Emily, we'd been walking this invisible tightrope with his parents. Publicly, they had accepted the new Bennett family unit. David, me, and Emily. In private, however, small cracks had begun to show. Comments whispered just out of earshot. "She's a sweet child, but not really one of us." Special outings arranged for Sophie alone. Family portraits carefully curated without Emily. I told myself they were from another generation. I told myself it wasn't worth upsetting the delicate balance. But as I watched Emily retreat to the corner, sitting alone while Sophie unwrapped an avalanche of brightly colored packages under Margaret's watchful eye, something in me shifted. This wasn't balance. This was exclusion. And Emily, my daughter, my heart, was beginning to notice. As the party wore on, David and I drifted through the crowded rooms, making polite conversation with distant relatives. Charles, jovial and booming as ever, slapped David on the back and offered me a stiff smile. No mention of Emily. No inquiry about how she was adjusting to 3rd grade. By the time cake was served, 2 elaborate tiers in pink and gold. Emily was perched on the edge of her chair, eyes wide with hope. But when Margaret called Sophie forward to blow out the candles, she motioned only for Andrew, Sophie's father, to join in the photos. David started to rise, but I caught his hand. "Don't," I whispered. "Emily will see." He sat back heavily, jaw tight. After the cake, the children scattered into the yard for games. I found Emily near the garden, quietly tracing the petals of a blooming hydrangea. "Hey, sweetheart," I said gently, kneeling beside her. "You okay?" She looked up at me with eyes that seemed far older than 8 years. "Mommy?" she whispered, voice trembling. Am I not really their family? I swallowed hard, blinking back the sudden sting behind my eyes. Oh, baby, I said, gathering her into my arms. You are my family. You are Daddy's family. And you are more loved than you will ever know. She nodded against my shoulder, but the doubt had already taken root, and as I held her, heart breaking, I made a silent vow. I would not let them hurt her again. We stayed in that garden corner longer than I'd intended. The laughter of children filtered through the hedges, high and unbothered. But here, among the flowers, Emily pressed tighter against me, her small frame stiff with an ache I couldn't ease. I stroked her hair gently. Sweetheart, I know it feels confusing sometimes, but please remember, who loves you matters more than who shares your blood. She nodded solemnly, wiping at her eyes. I just wanted them to like me, she whispered. They should, I said simply. That's not your job to earn. After a few minutes, she seemed steadier. We rejoined the party, or rather, we hovered at its edges. The adults were gathering for coffee and small talk now. The cake crumbs had been cleared, gift bags handed out. I glanced around, hoping for a sign that perhaps Margaret or Charles would approach Emily, but no. Margaret was busy charming one of Charles's business associates. Charles himself was regaling Andrew with a story about some golf trip. David caught my gaze across the room, brows lifted in silent question. I gave a small shake of my head. No change. No effort. Ready to go, love? I asked Emily quietly. She nodded. On the drive home, David finally spoke. She looked so happy this morning, he said softly, and now, his hands tightened on the wheel. It's like they just pretend she's invisible. They do more than that, I replied, voice low. They erase her. You saw the photos. David exhaled hard. I know. I thought maybe it would get better. I turned in my seat to face him more fully. It's not going to, I said, and we can't keep pretending this is normal. He glanced at me, troubled. What do you want to do? I don't know yet, I admitted. But we need a plan. Because Emily is starting to believe them, David. She asked me today if she was really family. His jaw clenched. She is, in every way that matters. Then we have to act like it, I said firmly. The rest of the drive passed in thoughtful silence. That night, after Emily was tucked into bed, her beloved Mr. Flopsy clutched tightly to her chest, I sat in our dimly lit living room, scrolling through my phone. Margaret had already posted an album of today's party, 37 photos, cake, decorations, Sophie surrounded by gifts, family shots, Andrew, Sophie, Margaret, Charles. Not a single photo of Emily. I stared at the screen, anger simmering beneath my skin. David joined me, reading over my shoulder. God, he muttered, they didn't even try. I looked at him, my voice quiet but certain. This is war now, I said. They've drawn the line. He nodded grimly. Upstairs, a soft sound caught my attention. Emily's door creaked open just a hair. Mommy? Came her small voice. I hurried to her room. What is it, baby? She blinked sleepily. If they don't want me, will you still want me? My heart cracked wide open. I knelt beside her bed, gathering her close. I will always want you, I whispered fiercely. You are mine, forever. She clung to me for a long moment, then drifted back to sleep. Her grip on my hand loosening at last. I stayed there beside her until her breathing evened, and as I rose quietly to leave, one thought burned clear in my mind. They would not do this to her again. Not ever. Later that night, lying awake beside David, my phone buzzed softly. A text from my boss. Chicago conference confirmed for next week. You'll need to fly out Tuesday morning. I stared at the screen. My gut twisted. Leaving Emily now felt unthinkable. But work didn't allow for hesitation. David stirred beside me. What is it? I showed him the message. He frowned, then took my hand. "I'll take care of things here," he promised. "You go. We'll be fine." I nodded, though doubt prickled at the edges of my resolve, and somewhere deep inside, a voice whispered, "Are you sure? Are you sure it will be fine? Would you trust leaving your child in the hands of a family that sees her as less than their own?" Stay tuned for the next chapter to find out what happens next. Chapter 2. The weekend I shouldn't have left. Sometimes the hardest choices are the ones we make against our better instincts. I stared at the confirmation email on my phone, the glow of the screen sharp in the darkness of our bedroom. The Chicago trip was unavoidable now. The client had finally agreed to an in-person presentation, and as lead strategist I was expected to deliver it. Across the room, David shifted in bed, still asleep. I swallowed, my mind racing. I didn't want to leave, not after the birthday party, not after the look on Emily's face when she'd asked if we still wanted her. But pulling out now wasn't an option, not without risking my position, a position that provided the very stability Emily depended on. I rose quietly, padded into the hallway, and checked on her. Emily lay curled beneath her comforter, Mr. Flopsy tucked beneath her chin. Her cheeks were flushed, lashes damp. Even in sleep she looked small, vulnerable. My heart twisted. I kissed her temple gently and whispered, "I love you." The next morning, over scrambled eggs and toast, I broke the news. "Sweetheart," I began carefully, "I have to go on a short work trip next week, just a few days." Emily's fork paused mid-air. "Will Daddy be here?" David cleared his throat. "Of course. I'll take care of everything." She relaxed slightly, though her eyes remained uncertain. That evening, as I was finalizing my packing list, David's phone rang. The conversation was short, clipped. When he hung up, his expression was troubled. "That was Boston," he said. "One of our biggest clients is threatening to pull out. They want me there tomorrow." The words hit like a blow. "You're going too?" I asked, trying to keep my voice calm. He nodded grimly. "I'm sorry, I know the timing is terrible. We scrambled through options. Our regular sitter was away at college. The backup had prior commitments. My mother, in Arizona, was recovering from knee surgery." "I can try to postpone the trip," I offered, though I knew it wasn't realistic. David shook his head. "We can't risk your job. And honestly, I can't risk losing this client either." He hesitated. "What if we ask my parents?" I stiffened. "David." "I know," he said quickly, "but they've been asking to spend more time with Emily. Maybe this could be good. A chance for them to show us they can do better." I wasn't convinced. Every fiber of my being screamed no, but the clock was ticking. I thought of Emily's face, of her questions, of the party photos. "I don't like it," I admitted. "But we don't have much choice." David kissed my forehead. "It'll be fine. I'll talk to them." The next morning, Margaret and Charles arrived promptly at 8 a.m. Overnight bags in hand, a faux bright smile on her face. It was a cozy. "We've got everything under control," she announced. "We raised 2 boys. 1 little girl will be a breeze." I knelt beside Emily. "You be good, okay? I'll call every night, and Daddy will be back soon." Emily nodded bravely, but I caught the flicker of doubt in her eyes. "I'll be okay, Mommy," she whispered. "I'll help with chores and everything." "No, baby," I wanted to say. "You shouldn't have to." Instead, I hugged her tight. "Just be a kid. Have fun. I love you more than all the stars. Love you to the moon and back." She whispered our goodbye. At SeaTac Airport, my gut churned. I fought the urge to turn around, to run back home. I video called as soon as I reached the hotel. Emily answered, her face framed in the soft glow of her nightlight. "Hi, Mommy." "Hi, sweetheart. How was your day?" "It was okay. Grandma made me pick up my toys twice. She said I was messy." I frowned. Emily was one of the tidiest 8-year-olds I knew. "Well, remember, their house, their rules. Just a couple more days, sweetie." "Okay." Her voice was small. Too small. When we ended the call, I stared at the screen, unease growing in my chest. Was I overreacting? Or was something wrong already? The second day began with back-to-back meetings. I should have been focused on slides and talking points. Instead, I kept stealing glances at my phone. By mid-afternoon, I couldn't take it anymore. I slipped out between sessions and called the house. No answer. I tried again. Still nothing. Panic rose in my throat. Finally, I texted David. "Can't reach them. Have you heard from your parents?" He replied 10 minutes later. "Talked to Dad this morning. Said everything's fine." Emily was helping around the house. Helping. My pulse quickened. I texted again. "Helping how?" No response. That evening, I FaceTimed again as soon as my final meeting ended. Charles answered. "Ooh, Lauren. She's finishing her dinner right now. I'll have her call you back." I waited. 30 minutes passed. An hour. No call. Finally, close to midnight, I tried again. Margaret answered, sounding irritated. "Emily's already asleep," she said sharply. She was overtired from playing all day. Something about her tone sent a chill through me. "What did she do today?" I asked. "Just normal things. We'll have her call you tomorrow. Good night." The line went dead before I could press further. Sleep was impossible that night. I tossed and turned, images of Emily's small face haunting me. The next morning, the final day of my trip, brought an unexpected twist. The Chicago client signed early, canceling our last day of meetings. Suddenly, I had an opening. A flight home tonight, or even this afternoon if I moved quickly. "Come sightseeing with us," my colleague suggested cheerily over breakfast. "You've earned it." But my mind was already made up. "I need to get home," I said, voice tight. Something's not sitting right. At the airport, as I waited for my flight, I tried calling the house again. No answer. I texted David. "Flying home early, will land by late afternoon. Haven't been able to reach your parents." He replied almost instantly, "That's great. Still stuck in Boston. Client issues more complicated than expected. Love you both." My stomach twisted. I stared out the plane window as we ascended, nerves raw. Was I imagining things? Was I overreacting, like Margaret would undoubtedly claim? Or was I seeing clearly for the first time? Landing at SeaTac, I texted again. No response. Driving through the quiet streets of Bellevue, the dread in my gut deepened with each mile. And then I turned onto Charles and Margaret Street and froze. Their car wasn't in the driveway. It was a Thursday afternoon. Where were they? And more importantly, where was Emily? I parked hastily and grabbed my suitcase, heart hammering as I approached the front door. The house was too quiet. "Hello, Emily?" I called, stepping inside. No answer. I moved room to room, voice rising with panic. "Emily, honey, it's Mommy." The living room was empty, save for Mr. Flopsy abandoned on the floor, a sight that made my breath catch. In the kitchen, crumbs littered the counter. A half-empty glass of water sat forgotten. And then I heard it, faint rhythmic scrubbing, a soft sniffle. I followed the sound, heart pounding, and turned the corner into the kitchen. Emily was on her hands and knees, a large brush in her small hands, scrubbing the tile floor with desperate focus. Tears streaked her face. Her curls were damp with sweat. She wore the same clothes from our last video call. Frozen in the doorway, I whispered, "Emily?" She startled, dropping the brush, her face flashing with fear. Fear that shouldn't belong on a child's face. "Mommy?" she gasped, voice trembling. I rushed to her, kneeling on the wet floor, pulling her shaking body into my arms. "Baby, what are you doing? Where are Grandma and Grandpa?" Her voice broke as she whispered the words that would shatter everything I thought I knew. "They took Sophie to Adventure Park. Grandma said I had to stay and scrub the floor. Because I'm not really family." What would you do if you found your child alone, scrubbing floors after being told she wasn't really family? Stay tuned for the next chapter to see how this story unfolds. Chapter 3. The floor that held my daughter's tears. Some floors can be scrubbed clean, others hold stains no amount of soap can wash away. My knees hit the cold, soapy tile as I pulled Emily into my arms. Her tiny body trembled against mine, skin cold and clammy beneath her sweat-damp clothes. She clung to me wordlessly, tears soaking into my blouse. I could feel her heart racing like a trapped bird's. "It's okay," I whispered, though nothing felt okay. Not anymore. "You're safe now." "Mommy's here." Her small fingers dug into my shoulder. "I tried, Mommy," she hiccuped. "I tried to make it clean." A sob caught in my throat. "You don't ever have to do this again," I promised. I pulled back just enough to cup her tear-streaked face. "Tell me, how long have you been alone?" She sniffled. "It's after breakfast. They went to Adventure Park with Sophie. Grandma said I couldn't go because I wasn't really family. She said I had to clean first and think about how clumsy I am." Her voice cracked on the last words. I fought to keep my expression calm for her sake, but inside rage twisted hot and sharp. "They left you here all day?" Emily nodded. "She said I'd better have the floor spotless by dinner, or no dessert. And I needed to think about why nobody else wanted me." The gasp escaped me before I could stop it. "No one else wanted you?" I echoed softly, horrified. She nodded again, voice barely audible. "Grandma said I was lucky you and Daddy took me in, because otherwise I would have ended up in an orphanage." The air seemed to leave the room. I gathered her closer. "Listen to me, Emily Grace Bennett. That is not true. We are the lucky ones, because we get to be your parents. You are wanted. You are loved. So loved." She buried her face in my shoulder. My mind raced. Charles and Margaret had crossed a line, one no apology could ever erase. They had left my child alone, afraid, scrubbing floors as punishment for not being born of their blood. I stood carefully, lifting Emily into my arms. "Come on, baby, let's get you cleaned up." In the bathroom, I gently washed her hands, raw and pruned from hours of scrubbing. Red marks stood out angry against her small palms. "I'm sorry," she whispered again, "for spilling juice." I swallowed hard. "You have nothing to be sorry for. Accidents happen, and no one should ever treat you this way because of it." She looked down. "Am I in trouble when they come back?" I crouched to meet her eyes. "You are not in trouble, but they are, and Mommy is going to make sure this never happens again." A flicker of relief crossed her face, though the fear remained. I helped her change into her favorite soft pajamas. Despite the afternoon hour, she needed comfort more than convention now. Then I wrapped her in a blanket and settled her on the couch with her favorite movie. "I'm gonna make us some ice cream," I said gently. "How does that sound?" She managed a small smile. "Okay." While she watched the screen, I stepped into the hallway, phone clutched tight in my hand. I texted David first. "Emergency, Emily was left alone. She's okay now, but I need to talk to you. Call ASAP," and left a message. Then I dialed heart-racing Karen, a specialist in family law and child protection cases. She answered on the second ring. "Lauren, what's going on?" I exhaled shakily. "I just found Emily home alone, scrubbing the kitchen floor. Charles and Margaret took Sophie to Adventure Park and left her here." A pause. Then Karen's voice sharpened. "That's child neglect, Lauren. You need to document everything, take photos, write down what Emily told you. This may need to be reported." I closed my eyes briefly. I'd hoped not to go that route for Emily's sake, for David's. But Karen was right. "This won't be swept under the rug," I said. "Good," she replied. "And if they come back tonight, do not let them speak to Emily alone. You have every right to set that boundary." "I will." I hung up, heart still pounding. When I returned to the living room, Emily was curled beneath her blanket, eyes drooping. I sat beside her, stroking her hair. "You're safe now, baby," I whispered. "Mommy's got you. No one will hurt you again." And as I held her close, one thought burned in my mind, clearer than any I'd ever known. I would fight for my daughter with everything I had, and this was only the beginning. The hours crawled by in a haze of ice cream spoons, whispered reassurances, and a phone that refused to ring. David hadn't called back yet, likely trapped in meetings. The silence gnawed at me. I texted again. "Please call. Urgent. Emily's safe, but they left her alone. Need to talk before they get back." Still no response. Meanwhile, I documented everything. Photos of the half-scrubbed floor, Emily's raw hands, the discarded brush, Mr. Flopsy lying abandoned, mute witness to the day's events, and most importantly, I wrote down every word Emily had told me, as clearly and neutrally as I could manage through my shaking fingers. By 5:30, the sun dipped low, casting long shadows across the living room. Emily had drifted to sleep against my side, exhausted from more than just physical effort. I watched the clock like a hawk. They'd be back soon, and I needed to be ready. Quietly, I helped Emily to her room, tucking her beneath her blanket. She blinked up at me sleepily. "Mommy, am I bad?" she whispered. My throat tightened. "No, sweetheart," I said firmly. "You are good. You are loved. You did nothing wrong." Her eyes fluttered closed. I stayed a moment longer, pressing a kiss to her forehead. Then I rose and moved to the front of the house, heart pounding. I wouldn't yell, I wouldn't cry, not in front of Emily, but I would make damn sure they knew exactly what they had done. At 5:42 p.m., I heard the crunch of tires in the driveway. Margaret's sharp voice floated in first, loud and animated. "I told you we should have stopped for dinner. Now she'll be hungry and cranky." The front door burst open mid-sentence. Margaret swept in, shopping bags emblazoned with Adventure Park logos swinging from her arm. Behind her, Charles carried Sophie, who looked flushed and drowsy from the day's excitement. Neither noticed me at first, until I cleared my throat. Margaret jolted, nearly dropping her bag. "Lauren? What on earth?" "What are you doing home?" Charles blinked. "Is Emily all right? Where is she?" I crossed my arms, voice cold steel. "She's upstairs, resting, after spending 4 hours scrubbing the kitchen floor, alone, in an empty house." Margaret's smile faltered. "Oh, don't be dramatic," she said airily. "She made a mess and needed to learn responsibility. We were gone only a few hours." My fists clenched. "You left an 8-year-old home alone, and you told her she wasn't really family, that she was lucky we took her in, that no one else wanted her." Charles shifted uncomfortably. Margaret's eyes narrowed. "Children exaggerate," she said dismissively. "And besides, it's the truth, isn't it?" That was it. The dam broke. "No, Margaret. The truth is that she is our daughter, legally, emotionally, entirely, and you will not speak to her that way ever again." Charles interjected quickly. "Now, let's all calm down. We can talk about this." "No," I cut in. "There is nothing to discuss. You crossed a line, and from this moment forward, you will not be alone with Emily again. I will be reporting this to David and potentially to Child Protective Services." Margaret flushed, mouth opening, then snapping shut. "You wouldn't dare," she hissed. "Watch me," I said, voice flat. The room crackled with tension. Even Sophie sensed it, shrinking behind her grandfather. Then, as if on cue, my phone buzzed. David's name lit the screen. I answered immediately, voice trembling now with both fury and relief. "David," I said, loud enough for everyone to hear, "you need to come home, now. How far would you go to protect your child from the very people who should love them?" Stay tuned for the next chapter to see what happens when David comes home. Chapter 4. The dinner they called finish. Sometimes it's not the words that betray you. It's the silence that follows them. I ended the call with David. hands trembling slightly, and turned back to the living room. Margaret and Charles were still standing there, shopping bags now abandoned on the floor, their forced composure cracking around the edges. "David's coming," I said evenly, "and until he does, you will not speak to Emily, you will not go upstairs, you will sit here and wait." Margaret scoffed, arms crossing tightly. "This is absurd, Lauren. You're blowing this entire thing out of proportion." Charles opened his mouth to speak, but I cut him off with a look that brooked no argument. "Your idea of teaching responsibility has crossed into emotional abuse and neglect. You're lucky I haven't called the police already." Margaret's face flushed deep red. "This is still our family's home," she snapped. "We are not guests here to be ordered about." I took a step closer, voice low and deliberate. "No, Margaret, this is our daughter's home, and after today, that distinction matters more than you apparently realize." For the next 40 minutes, the house simmered with unspoken tension. I stayed in the living room, sitting on the edge of the couch, a silent sentry. Margaret paced, muttering under her breath. Charles tried once to excuse himself to check on Sophie upstairs, but one sharp look from me stopped him cold. Emily remained in her room, door closed. I texted her once, "I'm here, you are safe, just rest for now." She replied with a simple heart emoji. My chest ached. When headlights finally swept across the driveway, I stood and squared my shoulders. Moments later, David burst through the front door, suitcase abandoned in the entryway, tie askew. His eyes swept the room, landing on me first. "Where is she?" "She's safe upstairs," I said softly, "but she's been through hell." His gaze darkened as it shifted to his parents. "Sit down," he said sharply. "Now." Even Margaret faltered at his tone. Charles cleared his throat. "Son, perhaps we should discuss this privately." "No," David said coldly. "We'll discuss it right here." Margaret attempted her defense first, voice sugary with false innocence. "It was just a little discipline, David. You know how children can be." Emily needed to learn some responsibility. David's voice was ice. "You left an 8-year-old child home alone. You humiliated her. You told her she wasn't really family." He turned to Charles. "And you let this happen." Charles looked away. I didn't know Margaret would." "Don't lie to me," David snapped. "You both made this choice. Together." Margaret's mask slipped then. "I refuse to be vilified for speaking the truth," she hissed. "That child is not of our blood. We have tried to accept her, but blood matters, David. It always has." The words hung in the air like a slap. I saw David flinch as if struck, and in that moment, something in him seemed to harden, a final fracture in whatever remained of his loyalty to them. "I see," he said softly. He looked at me, voice steady. "Get Emily, we're leaving." I blinked. "David?" He shook his head. "I will not let her spend one more night under this roof." Then he turned back to his parents, voice colder than I'd ever heard it. "And if either of you tries to contact her again, we will make this very, very public." The air in the room felt charged, brittle, as if a single wrong word might shatter what little civility remained. David's declaration, "We're leaving," hung between us like a gauntlet. Margaret recovered first, voice shrill with outrage. "You can't just take her and walk out, David. This is still your parents' house." "Our house." David's gaze didn't waver. "No, it's not our house anymore. Not after what you've done." Charles shifted uneasily. "Son, think about this. You're reacting emotionally. Let's all sit down to dinner and talk through this calmly." "There is no dinner," David snapped. "There is nothing left to discuss." But Margaret wasn't finished. "Oh, please," she spat. "We've done nothing every other parent hasn't done. Teaching discipline, enforcing boundaries. It's called parenting." My voice cut through the room, cold and precise. "Parenting does not involve abandoning a child, Margaret, or telling her she isn't really family. or making her scrub floors for hours while you take another grandchild to an amusement park. Margaret's eyes narrowed into slits. She's not a real Bennett. You think just signing a few adoption papers makes her one of us? Blood is blood, Lauren. Always has been. Always will be. I saw David flinch again, then square his shoulders as if a final weight had lifted. You've just proven exactly why we're leaving, he said. You can't mean that. Charles tried again, panic creeping into his voice. Son, you're blowing up this family over one misunderstanding. This isn't one misunderstanding. David said, voice gaining force. This is years of whispers, of exclusion, of making my daughter feel less than. And now, you've crossed the line into outright abuse. He turned to me, voice softer. Lauren, get Emily. Pack whatever she needs. I nodded, already moving toward the stairs. As I reached the landing, I heard Margaret's final desperate volley. She will never truly be yours, David. You can't change what she is. I froze, just for a moment, heart racing with a fury so cold it felt almost detached. Then I forced myself forward, step by steady step, until I reached Emily's room. She looked up as I entered, wide-eyed. Mommy, what's happening? I knelt beside her bed. We're going home, sweetheart, right now. Daddy and I are both here. You're safe. A flicker of relief crossed her face, quickly followed by worry. Are Grandma and Grandpa mad? They're upset, but this isn't about you, I said softly. You did nothing wrong. We love you, and we're going to keep you safe. She nodded solemnly. Together we packed a small overnight bag, clothes, toothbrush, Mr. Flopsy. When we came back downstairs, David was waiting by the door, shoulders squared in a way I hadn't seen since the worst days of his law career. Margaret stood stiffly by the dining table, face pale with fury. Charles hovered nearby, wringing his hands. David opened the front door and held out his hand to Emily. Come on, sweetheart, he said gently. Let's go. Emily looked between us, then reached for his hand. Margaret's voice rang out, brittle with desperation. David, if you walk out that door with her, don't expect to come back. David turned, gaze level. I'm not coming back. Not until you both understand what it means to truly love a child. He looked to me. Lauren? I stepped forward, taking Emily's other hand. Without another word, we walked out into the night air, cold, sharp, and infinitely cleaner than the house we left behind. As the car pulled away, Emily nestled between us in the back seat. Mr. Flopsy clutched tight. I love you both, she whispered, voice small but steady. We love you too, David and I said in unison. My phone buzzed in my lap. A new text from Karen. How did it go? Ready to take the next step. Karen wants to know if we're ready to fight, I said quietly. His grip tightened on the steering wheel. I'm ready. What would you do if protecting your child meant going to war with your own family? Stay tuned for the next chapter to see how this battle unfolds. Chapter 5. The Evidence They Can't Burn. Sometimes, to protect the ones you love, you have to stop playing nice. The night we left Charles and Margaret's house, I thought I'd feel relief. Instead, I lay awake beside David, heart racing, mind spinning. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Emily on that kitchen floor. Tiny hands red from scrubbing, eyes wide with fear. We couldn't go back. Not after that. But leaving was only the first move. Now came the hard part, proving what had happened and protecting our daughter from the inevitable fallout. By morning, we had a plan. David made coffee in tense silence while I texted Karen. We're ready. When can we meet? Her reply was swift. Come by my office at 10. Bring everything you documented. I exhaled, nerves jangling. David glanced up. We can do this, he said quietly. For Emily. I nodded, though doubt gnawed at the edges of my resolve. His parents weren't just cruel. They were cunning and their influence ran deep. At Karen's law office, a sleek space in downtown Bellevue, we laid out our evidence. The photos, the timeline, the written record of Emily's words. Karen skimmed through the materials, face growing graver by the minute. "This is solid," she said finally. "You've documented it well. The abandonment alone could trigger a CPS investigation." David tensed. "Do we want to take it that far?" Karen didn't sugarcoat. "If you want this to stop, if you want legal ground to enforce supervised contact, then yes, and frankly, after what they did, they deserve scrutiny." I swallowed hard. "I don't want to traumatize Emily further," I said softly, "but I won't let them near her again without protection." "Then let's proceed carefully," Karen advised. "We'll start by filing for an emergency protective order. That will restrict their access immediately. I'll also notify CPS. They'll conduct their own investigation." David and I exchanged a glance. "Do it," he said. Words spread faster than we'd expected. By that evening, my phone buzzed constantly, texts and missed calls from David's relatives. "I heard you took Emily out of the house. What's going on?" "Your mother is devastated. How could you embarrass the family like this?" "Please, David, call your father. We can work this out." I stared at the messages in disbelief. No one asked about Emily. No one asked what she had endured. It was all about image, of keeping the family reputation intact. 2 days later, the first formal notice arrived, a letter from Charles and Margaret's attorney delivered by courier. David opened it with shaking hands. "Our clients deny any wrongdoing," it read. They maintain that their actions were in line with reasonable disciplinary measures. They request an immediate cessation of defamatory statements and demand that contact with their granddaughter be restored. David's jaw tightened. "They still think they can spin this," he said. I met his eyes. "Then we'll give them something they can't spin." That night I reviewed every video call, every text, every scrap of communication we'd saved over the years. And buried deep in my old messages, I found it. A short video Emily had once recorded on my phone. She'd been playing with Sophie at the house. Margaret's voice in the background, sharp and unmistakable. "No, Emily, you can't have the same toy. Sophie is family. You need to understand that." I stared at the screen, hands trembling. Hard proof. Unfiltered. I forwarded it to Karen immediately. "This changes everything," she replied. "We'll use it in court." I set the phone down, heart pounding. No more doubts, no more second guessing. They had made Emily feel like less than family. Now the truth would speak for itself. The next morning, Karen filed the emergency protective order. It was granted by noon. Effective immediately, Charles and Margaret were prohibited from contacting Emily directly or indirectly. Any future visitation would require court approval. David and I sat in Karen's office, reading the order in silence. "It's just the first step," Karen reminded us. "But it gives us legal ground to stand on. Now, are you ready for what comes next?" I met her gaze. "We're ready." The battle didn't stay quiet for long. By afternoon, David's phone buzzed with new messages, not from his parents, but from relatives who had clearly been fed a very different version of events. "Your mother is devastated. She says Emily is being used as a pawn. We heard Emily made up stories. Are you sure you're doing the right thing? It's not too late to make this go away, David. Just drop the order." David's jaw clenched with every message. "They still don't get it," he muttered. I squeezed his hand. "They don't want to get it, because then they'd have to face what really happened." That evening, Karen sent us another update. "Media's picking up whispers about the case, local parenting blogs. Some of your extended family is talking." I wasn't surprised. Margaret had always cared more about public image than private truth. Now that image was cracking, and she was panicking. The next day, a letter arrived, not from their attorney this time, but a handwritten note from Charles. David read it aloud, voice steady. "Son, I know your mother can be harsh, but this is tearing the family apart. Please reconsider taking this to court. We all make mistakes. David's eyes hardened. Mistakes don't leave bruises, he said quietly. I nodded. And they don't abandon children or tell them they aren't family. That afternoon, the first court hearing was scheduled. Karen prepared us for battle. We'll introduce the video, your documented evidence, and witness statements. They'll likely argue this was a misunderstanding, that you're alienating Emily from her grandparents. They're the ones who alienated her, I said firmly. Karen smiled slightly. I believe you. And once the judge sees that video, they will too. Meanwhile, Emily began sessions with a trauma therapist. It wasn't easy. Some nights, she still woke crying, afraid that if she made one wrong move, we'd leave too. But slowly, with patience and love, she began to trust again. One evening, as we tucked her in, she whispered, "Mommy, when we go to court, will they be mad at me?" My heart twisted. "No, sweetheart," I said softly. "You told the truth. And we're so proud of you." David kissed her forehead. "We're doing this to protect you. That's what matters." The morning of the hearing dawned cold and gray. We dressed carefully, me in a simple navy dress, David in a dark suit. Karen met us at the courthouse steps, crisp and composed. "You're both strong," she said. "Just tell the truth. Let the evidence speak." Inside, the courtroom buzzed with quiet tension. Charles and Margaret sat stiffly at their table, flanked by their attorney. Margaret's glare could have cut glass. Charles looked older somehow, eyes shadowed with something that might have been regret or simply fear of losing control. The hearing began. Karen laid out our case with calm precision, the documented neglect, the abandonment, the video proof. When the judge viewed the clip, Margaret's voice, unmistakable, telling Emily she wasn't family, a heavy silence filled the room. Even their attorney paled. Margaret's mask cracked then. She rose suddenly, voice sharp. "This is manipulation. That child is confused. She's not even ours by blood." The judge's gavel struck once, sharp and final. "Mrs. Bennett, sit down," he ordered. "You will not speak unless addressed." David's hand gripped mine beneath the table, and in that moment I knew the tide had turned. Will justice finally be served? Or will old family loyalties cloud the truth? Stay tuned for the next chapter to see how the court decides. Chapter 6. The home we chose. Sometimes the fight isn't just about winning. It's about showing your child that they are worth fighting for. The courtroom felt colder that morning, though maybe it was just me. David and I sat side by side, hands clasped beneath the polished oak table. On the other side, Margaret sat, rigid, lips pressed tight, eyes burning with fury. Charles looked smaller than I'd ever seen him, shoulders hunched as if trying to disappear. Across from us, Judge Moreno flipped through the case file in silence, the damning words from the video still echoing in the room's charged air. "Not really family. You need to understand that." Karen leaned in. "He saw what he needed to see," she whispered. "Stay calm." I nodded, though my heart pounded in my chest. I thought about Emily, at home with her therapist, unaware of how today would shape her future. David squeezed my hand once, grounding me. Judge Moreno looked up at last. "I've reviewed the evidence presented, including the video recording, written documentation, and testimony." He began. His gaze settled on Charles and Margaret. "Your conduct, particularly the abandonment of a minor child and the pattern of emotional mistreatment, compels this court to act in the child's best interest." Margaret's breath hitched audibly. The judge continued, voice measured. "Effective immediately, visitation rights are revoked. No unsupervised contact will be permitted unless and until this court is satisfied that meaningful change has occurred." David exhaled slowly. I felt tears prick my eyes but held them back. We weren't here to gloat, only to protect. Judge Moreno closed the file. "This court recognizes Emily Bennett as the legal daughter of Miss and Mrs. Bennett in every sense. Blood does not define family. Love, safety, and commitment do. His gaze shifted back to us. Your daughter is fortunate to have parents who understand that. As the gavel fell, the weight in my chest finally lifted. I turned to David. "It's over," I whispered. "Not over," he said quietly, "but we've taken back control." And for the first time in weeks, I allowed myself to hope. The days following the hearing unfolded like a slow exhale, the kind you don't realize you've been holding until your lungs burn. We returned home to Emily that afternoon, arms open, hearts full. When we told her, gently, that the court had decided to protect her, she blinked in surprise. "I don't have to see them anymore?" she whispered. "Not unless you want to," I said softly. David knelt beside her. "And if you ever do, we'll be right there with you." She threw her arms around us both. "I love you," she said fiercely. "I love you more," I whispered. In the weeks that followed, the house began to feel like ours again. Emily's therapist guided her through the aftermath with patience and grace. Together we created new routines: Friday movie nights, Sunday pancake breakfasts, quiet afternoons curled up with books and Mr. Flopsy. I watched her gradually reclaim her joy. The shadows in her eyes faded. Her laughter returned, hesitant at first, then full-throated and free. One afternoon, while tidying the living room, I came across a drawing tucked into Emily's sketchpad. 2 stick figures, David and me, holding hands with a third smiling figure in the middle. Her. Above them, in careful, looping letters, she'd written, "My family, the one I choose." Tears blurred my vision. When David saw it later, he wrapped me in his arms. "We're doing it," he said quietly. "We're healing her." Margaret and Charles kept their distance. The protective order ensured that. But one crisp Saturday morning, a letter arrived, postmarked in Margaret's familiar sharp hand. I hesitated, then opened it. "Lauren and David," it began. I was wrong. I let old beliefs blind me to what mattered. I know words can't undo what was done, but I want Emily to know, if she ever chooses to forgive me, I will spend the rest of my life earning it. I read it twice, then I folded it carefully, placing it in a drawer. Forgiveness wasn't mine to give. That choice, like so many now, belonged to Emily. Months passed. The scars remained, but they no longer defined us. At a school concert in spring, Emily stood on stage, face radiant as she sang with her classmates. In the audience, David and I sat hand in hand. Present, whole and shaken, as her clear voice soared, I caught Margaret's figure at the back of the room, alone, watching from a distance. For a brief moment, our eyes met. She gave a small nod, not asking for absolution, only acknowledging the truth. I returned it. Some lessons come too late, but others are learned just in time. Thank you for staying with us through this deeply personal story. If today's journey has shown us anything, it's that true family is built on love, not blood, and that standing up for those you love is always worth the fight. To every parent, guardian, or loved one facing impossible choices, you are not alone. If this story resonated with you, please consider sharing it. And don't forget to subscribe for more real-life stories of resilience, justice, and the power of unwavering love. Until next time, remember, sometimes the strongest families are the ones we choose.